Distinguished viewers, we are watching the unraveling of a strategic assumption that has anchored North American energy relations for half a century. The United States has long operated under the belief that Canada's energy resources would flow south across the border as a matter of economic necessity and geographic logic. That assumption died quietly in the waters off Kitimat, British Columbia, when liquefied natural gas carriers began sailing west toward Asian markets instead of feeding American pipelines running south. What makes this shift particularly consequential is not merely the redirection of molecules of methane, it is the elimination of American leverage over a neighbor that Washington took for granted for too long. When President Donald Trump reached out to Prime Minister Mark Carney seeking relief on liquefied natural gas exports, the response was not a negotiation, it was a fait accompli. Canada has built the infrastructure, secured the contracts, and opened the markets that make American demands irrelevant. The context requires clarity. The Trump administration imposed a 35% across-the-board tariff on Canadian goods in August of 2025, with energy products facing a 10% levy. The stated objective was to extract concessions from Ottawa on border security, trade terms, and continued energy supply at prices favorable to American consumers and industries. The unstated assumption was that Canada had nowhere else to go. American markets absorbed 96% of Canadian crude oil exports and virtually all Canadian natural gas exports for decades. Washington believed this dependency created leverage, that tariffs would force Canadian capitulation because the alternative was economic devastation. Prime Minister Carney saw the situation differently. He recognized that dependency is vulnerability, and he moved with remarkable speed to eliminate that vulnerability through what he calls nation-building infrastructure. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. According to data released by Industrial Info Resources just last week, Canadian natural gas exports to the United States averaged 9 billion cubic feet per day in January of 2025. As of early January 2026, that figure had collapsed to 5.4 billion cubic feet per day. That represents a 40% decline in less than 12 months. To put this in perspective, the reduction equals roughly 3.6 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas that previously flowed into American pipelines, power plants, and industrial facilities. That volume could heat approximately 18 million American homes through a winter heating season. It represents the feedstock for billions of dollars worth of petrochemical production. And it is gone, redirected to markets where Canada faces neither tariffs nor political hostility. The mechanism of this redirection is LNG Canada's facility in Kitimat, a $40 billion project that became operational in the summer of 2025. The first cargo of liquefied natural gas departed in June, destined for South Korean buyers. By November, the facility's second processing train came online, and the project had shipped over 20 cargoes to Asian markets. Each cargo represents roughly 3.1 billion cubic feet of natural gas in liquefied form, gas that would have traditionally flowed south through pipelines to American markets. The facility's first phase has the capacity to export 14 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually. At full capacity, that translates to approximately 2 billion cubic feet per day. Phase 2, for which investors are expected to approve final funding in 2026, would double that capacity to 28 million tons annually, equivalent to roughly 4 billion cubic feet per day. The strategic significance becomes clear when you examine who's buying Canadian liquefied natural gas and why. The consortium behind LNG Canada includes Shell, Petronas from Malaysia, PetroChina, Mitsubishi Corporation from Japan, and Korea Gas Corporation. These are not speculative buyers. These are established energy giants representing the largest natural gas consuming markets in Asia. They have signed long-term contracts guaranteeing purchases at prices that are consistently 30 to 40% higher than North American benchmark prices. For Canadian producers, the economic logic is straightforward. Selling gas to Asia through Kitimat generates substantially higher revenue than selling the same gas to the United States through traditional pipelines. Even accounting for liquefaction costs and ocean transport, the Asian premium makes exports westward more profitable than exports southward. This creates a structural incentive for Canadian producers to redirect supply, an incentive that exists independent of political considerations or tariff disputes. The infrastructure that enables this pivot is the Coastal GasLink pipeline, a 670-kilometer system connecting natural gas fields in northeastern British Columbia to the Kitimat terminal. This pipeline physically bypasses the traditional north-south pipeline networks that have historically fed American markets. It represents a permanent redirection of Canadian gas flows, a physical manifestation of strategic independence. Construction on this pipeline was completed despite significant opposition from environmental groups and some Indigenous communities. The Carney government pushed it through because the strategic value was undeniable. Without Coastal GasLink, Canadian gas producers remain captive to American buyers. With it, they have optionality. And in the world of commodity markets, optionality is everything. The timing of this shift could not be worse for the United States. American natural gas demand is climbing rapidly, driven by multiple factors. Data centers supporting artificial intelligence computing require enormous amounts of electricity, much of it generated from natural gas. Liquefied natural gas export terminals along the Gulf Coast are ramping up capacity, requiring additional feedstock gas. Industrial users from chemical plants to steel manufacturers depend on natural gas for both energy and raw materials. Meanwhile, American domestic natural gas production growth is slowing. According to the Energy Information Administration, United States dry natural gas production will average 109.1 billion cubic feet per day in 2026, marking only a 1.3% increase from 2025. That compares with a 4.3% annual increase from 2024 levels. The production growth rate is decelerating precisely when demand is accelerating. The mathematical consequence is price pressure. Henry Hub natural gas prices, the American benchmark, averaged below $2 per million British thermal units in 2024. The Energy Information Administration forecast prices will average $3.90 in 2026. Some private forecasts project even higher, anticipating prices reaching $4.50 to $5 by year-end. The substantial portion of this price increase is directly attributable to reduced Canadian imports. When 3.6 billion cubic feet per day of supply disappears from the market, prices rise. American consumers and businesses will pay the cost. Consider the impact on American households. Natural gas heats 47% of American homes. According to EIA projections, a family in the Midwest using natural gas for heating could see their winter energy bills increase by 25 to 30% in 2026 compared to 2024 levels. For a household already managing inflation in food costs, transportation, and housing, an additional $50 to $100 per month in heating costs during winter months represents genuine financial stress. Manufacturing sectors face even more direct consequences. Natural gas is a critical feedstock for chemicals, plastics, fertilizers, and steel production. Companies operating large petrochemical complexes along the Gulf Coast built their business models around cheap and abundant American natural gas, supplemented by reliable Canadian imports. When prices double from $2 to $4 per million British thermal units, profit margins compress dramatically. Some facilities become uneconomical to operate at higher input costs, leading to production cuts and workforce reductions. Prime Minister Carney has made the strategic calculation explicit. In November of 2025, he announced a second phase of what his government calls nation-building projects through Canada's Major Projects Office. These initiatives represent $116 billion in investment across multiple sectors. Among them is the Case Ilisum's LNG facility, which would become Canada's second major liquefied natural gas export terminal, with capacity to export 12 million tons annually, all destined for Asian markets. The message to Washington is unmistakable. Canada is not seeking permission. Canada is not negotiating terms. Canada is building permanent infrastructure to serve markets that value Canadian energy and treat Canada with respect. The contrast with American behavior could not be starker. While President Trump threatens annexation and imposes punitive tariffs, Asian buyers are offering premium prices and long-term contracts. The choice facing Canadian policymakers is not complicated. The geopolitical implications extend beyond bilateral relations between Ottawa and Washington. European nations are watching this dynamic with intense interest. Germany's chancellor referenced North American energy market instability in a December 2025 speech. noting that diversification of supply sources remains critical for European energy security. That is diplomatic language acknowledging that when the United States treats its most reliable energy partner with hostility and unpredictability, other nations cannot assume American-led energy markets will remain stable. The erosion of trust has consequences that extend far beyond natural gas molecules. China benefits strategically from this rift. Beijing has positioned itself as a stable, long-term partner for Canadian energy exports. PetroChina's investment in LNG Canada gives Chinese state-owned enterprises a direct stake in Canadian energy infrastructure. This is precisely the outcome that American strategic planners sought to avoid for decades. The entire purpose of maintaining close energy integration with Canada was to ensure that North American energy resources remained within a Western-aligned economic bloc. Trump's tariff strategy has accomplished the opposite, pushing Canada toward deeper integration with Chinese capital and Asian markets. The legal and economic structures supporting this shift are now locked in. Long-term contracts between Canadian producers and Asian buyers typically run 20 to 25 years. These agreements specify volumes, pricing mechanisms, and delivery schedules. They cannot be easily unwound. Once an Asian utility signs a contract committing to purchase Canadian liquefied natural gas for 2 decades, that gas is no longer available to American buyers, regardless of what Washington offers or demands. This is the permanence that makes the shift so consequential. The Trump administration appears to have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of global energy markets. Tariffs are a blunt instrument designed to inflict economic pain in service of political objectives. They work only when the target has no alternatives. By the time Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian energy, Canada had spent years building the infrastructure that creates alternatives. The Kitimat facility did not appear overnight. Planning began over a decade ago. Construction took years. Final investment decisions were made in 2018. The Coastal GasLink pipeline faced court challenges, protests, and regulatory hurdles, yet persisted through to completion. All of this happened while American policymakers assumed Canadian dependency was permanent and immutable. The response from affected American industries has been swift and alarmed. Industrial conglomerates including Nucor Corporation and United States Steel have flagged natural gas price volatility as a significant risk factor in recent earnings calls. United States Steel specifically noted in its fourth quarter 2025 earnings report that reduced Canadian energy imports create pricing uncertainty that threatens the competitiveness of domestic steel production. When American steel cannot compete on cost with imports due to higher energy expenses, the result is either plant closures or requests for additional tariff protection, creating a cycle of escalating trade restrictions. Utility companies are also reacting strategically. Duke Energy and Southern Company both announced in late 2025 that they are accelerating renewable energy projects, specifically because natural gas price forecasts make those investments more economically attractive. That sounds progressive until you consider the timeline. Renewable capacity takes years to build. Solar farms, wind installations, and battery storage systems require permitting, construction, and grid integration. During the transition period, which will extend through most of this decade, higher natural gas prices persist, and consumers pay the premium. Political reactions within the United States reflect growing concern. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska publicly criticized Trump's approach in a December 2025 statement. "We cannot tariff our way to energy security. Canada is our ally, not our adversary, and treating them like China makes no strategic sense." Those words from a Republican senator in a major energy-producing state carry weight. Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers have seized on the issue as evidence that Trump's trade policies are backfiring. Senate Majority Leader pushed through a resolution in October 2025 attempting to block Trump's Canada tariffs under the Congressional Review Act. The resolution passed the Senate but stalled in the House of Representatives. Nevertheless, the vote demonstrated bipartisan concern that Trump's strategy was producing outcomes opposite to those intended. Expert assessments have converged on a stark conclusion. Eurasia Group's Top Risks 2026 report, published in early January, specifically addressed Canada-United States relations. The key quote is worth considering in full. Carney will struggle to sell the kind of concessions on market access or defense purchases that Trump could tout as a win. While Carney's diversification strategy carries its own risks, Trump's tariff approach has accelerated rather than prevented Canada's pivot away from United States dependence. That analysis comes from one of the world's leading political risk consultancies, and it identifies the core problem. Trump created the very outcome he sought to prevent. Energy economist Philip Verlager, who accurately predicted oil price shocks in 2008, warned in a January 2026 analysis that the United States is sleepwalking into a situation where its most reliable energy partner has structurally reduced its dependency on American markets. This will create price volatility and supply constraints that tariffs cannot solve. Verlager's analysis emphasizes that the problem is no longer political, but structural. Even if Trump reversed course tomorrow and eliminated all tariffs on Canadian goods, the infrastructure redirecting Canadian gas to Asia is built. The contracts with Asian buyers are signed. The economic incentives favoring Asian exports over American sales are locked in. The damage is done. Looking forward, the trajectory is clear. Canadian liquefied natural gas shipments to Asia will continue ramping up significantly. LNG Canada is bringing additional processing capacity online through early 2026. Canada will finalize additional long-term supply contracts with Japanese and South Korean buyers, locking in volumes that would otherwise have been available to American markets. The Casey Leesoms project will receive its final investment decision, cementing another 12 million tons per year of export capacity aimed exclusively at Asia. The contrast between Canadian and American energy policy over the past decade is instructive. Canada identified Asian liquefied natural gas demand as a strategic opportunity and methodically built the infrastructure to serve that market. Despite political changes, court challenges, environmental opposition, and construction delays, the project moved forward. Multiple governments, liberal and conservative, maintained policy continuity because the strategic logic was sound. The United States, conversely, lurched from administration to administration with wildly different energy policies. The Obama administration emphasized climate concerns and renewable energy. The first Trump administration promoted fossil fuel production, but alienated allies with erratic trade policy. The Biden administration rejoined climate agreements and paused liquefied natural gas export approvals. The second Trump administration imposed tariffs on the country, supplying the majority of America's energy imports. This policy incoherence has consequences. When allies and trading partners cannot predict American behavior, they build alternatives. Canada's westward pivot is the result. The Carney government's strategy extends beyond liquefied natural gas. It represents a comprehensive effort to reduce Canadian economic dependence on American markets across all sectors. The goal, stated explicitly by Carney in November 2025, is to double Canada's non-United States exports over the next decade. Energy is the leading edge of this diversification, but it is not the only component. Canadian agricultural products, minerals, manufacturing goods, and services are all being actively marketed to Asian, European, and Latin American buyers. The shift in natural gas exports is the most visible and consequential, but it is part of a broader strategic reorientation. What should concern American policymakers is not that Canada is diversifying. Diversification is rational economic policy for any nation. What should concern them is that Canada is diversifying specifically because the United States has become unreliable. When your closest ally, most integrated economic partner, and most dependable energy supplier concludes that dependence on you is a strategic vulnerability to be eliminated, you have fundamentally failed at alliance management. That is the legacy of Trump's tariff approach. The Trump administration sought to use tariffs as leverage to extract concessions from Canada. The result has been the opposite. Canada has used the threat posed by tariffs as justification to build permanent infrastructure that eliminates American leverage. Canadian natural gas that once had no choice but to flow south now flows west to buyers paying premium prices. Canadian crude oil that once was captive to American refineries now reaches Asian markets through the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. Canadian policymakers who once viewed the American market as irreplaceable now view it as optional. This is not a negotiating position, this is a completed strategic pivot. The welcome that Asian buyers have provided to Canadian energy exports stands in stark contrast to the hostility Canadian exporters face from Washington. When President Trump imposes tariffs, threatens annexation, and publicly demeans Canada as the 51st state, he makes the argument for diversification more compelling than any Canadian politician ever could. Every insult, every tariff, every threat validates Prime Minister Carney's thesis that Canada must reduce its dependence on American markets. The consequences will compound over time. As Canadian producers become more deeply integrated into Asian supply chains, reversing the shift becomes progressively more difficult. Capital invested in liquefaction facilities, pipelines, and export terminals represents sunk costs that will be monetized over decades. Workers trained to operate these facilities will build careers around Asian exports. Communities that benefit economically from this new industry will resist any policy that threatens it. The infrastructure creates its own political constituency, one that will defend the Asian pivot regardless of who leads in Ottawa or Washington. For the United States, the loss extends beyond natural gas volumes. It represents the erosion of strategic influence over a nation that shares the world's longest undefended border, participates in integrated continental defense through NORAD, and has historically aligned with American positions on most major geopolitical questions. When Canada concludes that its interests are better served by deeper integration with Asian markets than by continued dependence on American goodwill, something fundamental has broken in the relationship. That break will not be easily repaired because it is structural rather than personal. This is not about whether Canadian and American leaders like each other. This is about whether Canada believes it can rely on the United States as a stable, predictable partner. The evidence of the past year suggests the answer is no. The tragedy of this situation is that it was entirely avoidable. The United States had every advantage in maintaining close energy integration with Canada. Geographic proximity reduces transport costs. Shared regulatory standards facilitate trade. Compatible legal systems protect investments. A common language eases commercial relationships. Cultural similarities build trust. All of these advantages existed and could have been leveraged to maintain American access to Canadian energy resources. Instead, the Trump administration chose coercion through tariffs, assuming dependency would force compliance. The assumption was wrong, and the cost of that error will be measured in higher energy prices, reduced industrial competitiveness, and diminished strategic influence for years to come. Prime Minister Carney has built the infrastructure of independence. Asian markets have provided the destination, and the United States has lost leverage it will not regain.